You betrayed your uniform! Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Uniform, which is episode 13 of season 5 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win the poll for my Deep Space Nine review was For the Uniform. So For the Uniform is the episode where Sisko is on a mission, some may call it a vendetta, to arrest Michael Eddington, while Michael Eddington commands the Maquis, and they poison some Cardassian worlds so that Cardassians cannot live there but humans can. So Sisko responds by poisoning some Maquis worlds so that humans can't live there but Cardassians can, and he threatens to do more unless Eddington surrenders himself, so he does. So, well, that was a lot more happens in the episode, but that was the quick synopsis of it. So this is an interesting episode for me personally, because I've noted this before sometimes, because when I do these episodes, those in-depth Star Trek episode reviews that, as I mentioned, are chosen by polls, or they're kind of done at random, so I don't go any particular order. Like, I review episodes all over the place, and it's kind of like a mess. So basically, I watch the episode out of context. I do other reviews on my channel, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I've done for every Star Trek series so far, except for the original series, which I'll get there eventually, where I go season by season. So I watch the entire show in order, and then review each episode of each season and do a video for each season. So it's a different beast, and in those videos, of course, I don't have as much time to talk about each episode, so I have to go do a brief almost speed dating like review, although some videos end up being really long because I have so much to say about it. But I try to keep my thoughts on each episode a bit more brief, whereas in these in-depth reviews like this one, I talk for a lot longer about each episode, which is why I do both of them, because they're two different things. Where the season review is more of a look at the season as a whole, even though I do go episode by episode, whereas these, I'm not looking at the whole season, just a specific episode. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because it's a different, I realize, and there's some episodes, not very many, but there's a couple, and this is one of them, where I actually think differently of it watching it out of context as opposed to in context. Because in context, I didn't give this episode a very good rating. In fact, if I remember, I haven't looked it up, but if I remember, I think I gave this a negative rating, like a 4 or 3 or something, and I didn't care much for it, and I said it was one of the poorer episodes of the season. And watching it out of context, I actually like it. I actually liked it a lot more. So I think that's actually really interesting. And I think what are some of the reasons that might be? Maybe I'm just in a different mood, or, maybe I just changed my mind, but I think it has more to do with watching season 5. Maybe this episode kind of just blends in with all the episodes with season 5, and in my opinion, and in my sister's opinion, a lot of other people don't have this opinion, but it's something we feel strongly about, at least I know I do, is that season 5 is kind of bland. It's actually one of my least favorite seasons of Deep Space Nine, and I think the writing and each episode seemed to not offer that much new or reason for existing, and it seemed a bit more bland, particularly when compared to other seasons like 3 and 6, which were great. So that might be another reason. Maybe just felt like another line of episodes, I think. But yeah, it is interesting. But I think one of the main reasons why I might feel that way is because, and it's something I still have an issue with even watching it out of context, but I guess it hits me less, is that the build up for this episode does not seem at all earned. Like, what happens in this episode doesn't seem earned, because most of the build up, the things leading to this episode, occur off screen. Like, we're told about, like, so, for example, we're told that Cisco has been hunting Ennington for 8 months. Really? We've seen exactly 0 of that. And it's actually, quite frankly, it's hard for me to buy that during this whole time, between the end of season 4 and the beginning of season 5, like all the episodes we got, with Broken Link, with Odo and getting his changeling powers taken away, or this Klingon war breaking out, and Cisco having to, pretend to be a Klingon and go to this Klingon thing, and all the other stuff, and like them being trapped in the Gamma Quadrant with the Dominion ship or whatever, all that stuff. We're supposed to buy that in between all those events, Cisco has been hunting for Eddington. I don't. I don't buy it. I'm sorry. And that was my biggest issue with this episode. And that's, I think, the thing that irked me the most. And I think, even though that still bothers me watching it out of context, I think it's more apparent in context, where this episode seems very jarring if I go straight from watching season 4. So this episode is a sort of sequel, you could say, to the episode 4, The Calls, which was at the end of season 4, towards the end of season 4. And this is kind of mid-season 5. So all that time in between, all this other shit happened, and we never saw, so there was no mention of the Maquis, no mention of Michael Eddington between those 2 episodes at all. 0. And we're supposed to buy that Cisco has been hunting, and he's been driven crazy with trying to find Eddington, when there was 0 mention of this. And that's a lot more apparent during a watch, because it seems jarring, it seems out of place, it seems like, we're meant to believe that Cisco's been hunting Eddington and has this obsession that's driving him crazy with catching him, and I can't believe it. And I guess that's easier to buy out of context, because it's just a random. It's like if there were a movie and we're told, this cop has an obsession with already, like, the movie starts with the cop already having this obsession with catching a criminal. Like, we can buy that because the movie's just the beginning. But if you're watching a TV show and you have all these episodes where you see the character doing other things, not ever mentioning this one character, that's harder to buy. And here's the other thing that I found really, really jarring about this episode that really, really bothered me. Michael Eddington, they just casually refer to Michael Eddington as the leader of the Maquis in this episode. What? The leader of the Maquis? Like, last time we saw him, he was a Starfleet officer who was spying for the Maquis, and then eventually when he was caught, he, full-on defected and admitted he was a Maquis, but he was, by all admissions and by all logic, just a regular low ranking member of the Maquis. Now all of a sudden he's the fucking leader, and I remember the first time I saw this episode, I remember that really, really bothering me. I'm like, what? He's not the fucking, what the hell are you talking about? He's not the leader of the Maquis. What the hell? And we're just meant to buy this, and everyone acts like it's common knowledge, like, oh yeah, of course he's the leader of the Maquis. Like, they just casually mention it, and it was so jarring for me. And I guess in general, and I know a lot of people don't have an issue with this kind of storytelling, but in general, I do. In general, I don't like stuff occurring off screen, and then the characters acting like it's common knowledge. Like, oh yeah, of course we know this. It makes me feel very distant from the storytelling, like I'm missing something, or like I'm just only getting part of the story. 24 would do this a lot. In fact, they bragged about how it made people feel like there was a living universe or whatever, where all this shit would happen in between seasons. They would act like, but that bothers me. I don't like that kind of storytelling. I don't think it's good. I think it alienates me from what's going on, from the story, and it makes me feel like I'm not getting the full picture. And that is my main gripe with this episode, is that I feel like this episode would have been much, much better had there been other episodes in between this episode and For the Calls. And I think that is a must, actually, that we needed. So I don't think there's anything wrong with this episode per se. But if you had a lead up. Like, if you had the lead up, if you had, like, several episodes, maybe one at the end of Season 4 and another one at the start of Season 5, or maybe even 2 in Season 5 before you get to this one, where Sisko's hunting Eddington and then establish that Eddington has become the leader of the Maquis, then I would actually like this episode a lot more, because it would feel earned. And I would feel more invested in what's going on, and it would feel more natural. And in fact, you could probably get away with just one episode if you wanted to, that sort of established all this stuff, that established Sisko's obsession with finding Eddington and him becoming the leader of Maquis. In fact, I think that would work well, especially if Eddington gets the better of Sisko in that particular fictional episode I'm talking about, and that would lead up perfectly to this episode where Sisko gets the better of him. Now, I know I can already hear the counter argument in my head of people saying, well, Eddington got the better of Sisko in For the Calls, so this is the counterbalance where Sisko gets and plus For the Calls, for the uniform, get it? But that was the introduction of Eddington as the Maquis. In fact, we didn't even know that Eddington was working with the Maquis until till the last 5 minutes of that episode. So that's not good enough. Like, you need a whole episode of Eddington being in the Maquis, and yes, establish that he becomes the leader. Because let me make something clear. I've heard reasoning of why Eddington would be the leader of the Maquis, and I actually like it. Like, it makes sense. Like, there's nothing wrong with Eddington being the leader of the Maquis. Actually, when I think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because he is a seasoned, very well experienced Starfleet security officer, where the Maquis is mostly made up of colonists who don't really have much military experience. Although you did have other people like Chakotay, but he left. He got trapped in the Delta Quadrant. But then Ensign Rowe, or Lieutenant Rowe Laren, we never learned what happened to her. There's a lot of beta canon speculation, but she was inexperienced. She went through this advanced tactical training, so you think maybe she would be very helpful. But leaving those aside, Starfleet, the Maquis was mainly... Oh, there was also that dude, Hutchinson or whatever, who was Sisko's buddy, who was a captain, so he had some experience too. But, so you think one of them would... And that's why I sort of... in general, I've been against this argument that the Maquis are a bunch of idiots who don't really know what they're doing, which is what the two-parter of the Maquis kind of portrayed them as. But it doesn't make... That argument never works for me, because you have people like Hutchinson and Chakotay and Rowe Laren, who full on know what they're doing. So you think that they would be sort of, even if all the other people, all the colonists and people who were idiots and didn't know what they're doing, you would have they would put those people in positions of power, because they would know how to effectively run a resistance or terrorist organization, or however you'd like to call them. And then Thomas Riker, that's another one. See, it seems like you have lots of experience, Starfleet. But anyway, the idea makes sense, though, that someone like Eddington would be put in command of the Maquis. Someone who knows how to do tactics, and this is something that this episode makes clear, which I appreciate, that he's actually a really excellent and brilliant tactician. So the idea of Eddington being the leader of the Maquis makes sense. The fact that they just casually mention this and it comes out of nowhere, that's what fucking bothers me. That's what I don't buy. That's what makes it hard for me to accept he was the leader of the Maquis, because this has not been established, and it just mentioned like we should already know this, which we shouldn't. And so that's a huge issue for me. I'm sorry, and I'll compare it to Section 31 or Sloane's appearances in DS9, because that's actually similar, because you had 3 episodes with Sloane. You had the Inquisition, which the idea of Sloane being Section 31 wasn't introduced until the very end of that episode, the last 5 minutes. Then you have the Inter Armen Emin Shemin Silent Ligus, however you pronounce it. That episode where, that is the key episode that, compared to this Eddington arc, that's missing. But in the Section 31 arc, you have that episode that fully establishes Sloane as badass Section 31 spy who gets the better of Bashir in that episode, and puts him in his place. And then if the story arc finishes in the episode Extreme Measures, where Bashir turns around and gets the better of Sloane, and that's when Sloane dies. So, comparatively speaking, it's like they went straight from Inquisition straight to Extreme Measures without having to Inter Armen Emin Silent Ligus episode. It's like they skipped over that episode, and as you know, with the Sloane arc, that's the best episode. That is the key episode. So that's what I think is missing. We're missing an Inter Armen Shemin Silent. I know I'm purposely saying it wrong, so don't get on me. But I couldn't say it right even if I tried, to be fair. But anyway, the Silent Ligus, we're missing that episode and Eddington's arc, and that's what bothers me, and that's why I don't think this episode works. We're missing a key episode. I know later you also have Blaze of Glory, but for me, that's more of an epilogue, because this is the end of the conflict between Sisko and Eddington, because here Sisko arrests Eddington, and boom, that's the end. The Blaze of Glory was more of had more to do with how the Maquis was wiped out by the Dominion, and so that was more of the end of the Maquis altogether, where this is the end of the conflict between Sisko and some people might try to make an argument, but Mark, it is a 3-episode arc because this is the middle episode with no. That doesn't work. Blaze of Glory is an epilogue, and that has more to do with the Dominion wiping out the Maquis. The Eddington arc is just for the cause and for the uniform, so we're missing a middle episode in between those two. Just my opinion, of course. I know not everyone will agree with that. But, yeah, I think part of the reason why I enjoyed this episode more out of context, even though that aspect still bothered me, it wasn't as in the forefront of my mind because I'm watching it out of context, because I'm not like, wait a second. And the reason why I liked it more is because I think this, when I look past that, this episode is actually structured really well. It is an interesting character beat with Sisko. Again, you have to do it out of context, because in context it seems to come out of nowhere. But out of context, it seems like an interesting character story for Sisko. And yeah, it does make sense, even without that missing episode we should have had, that of course Sisko would feel betrayed by Eddington just by what we saw at the end of For the Cause. But we're still missing an episode, in my opinion. But anyway, yeah, so So it's an interesting episode, and I think it's well structured. I like how it starts with Eddington tricking Cisco and like trying to give him a lesson and be like, look at all those those colonies that are victims of the Cardassian Federation Treaty, and Cisco's like, no, they're victims of the Maquis. And it sets up the sort of differing perspective. But of course Cisco is kind of like, I'm not here to debate Federation policy with you. You were a Starfleet officer, you swore an oath, you betrayed that oath, and you deserve to be arrested for that. End of story. Just what you agree or disagree with Federation policy, there's other avenues you could take. You're betraying them, spying on the Federation and for the Maquis, and sabotaging the Federation Starfleet ships is unacceptable and treasonous. That's Cisco's point of view, which I can buy. So, and then the episode itself, of course, has a sense. Eddington is portrayed as quite a smart tactician in this episode, so it was actually a well-structured episode where Eddington continues to get the best of Cisco and stump Cisco, and Cisco has to deal with his inner demons on being defeated. And I love the scene where he's like, is he a man? Is he a god? Is he a wormhole alien? Is he a changeling? No, he's just a man just like me, and he beat me. And that's great. And then they realize that the end solution is for Cisco is the fact that Eddington sees himself as the hero and Cisco as the villain. So the end solution is to play into that role and force him to do whatever good hero in any melodrama does, is give themselves up for the betterment of the cause, which I think was actually quite an interesting way. So the structure of the episode itself, independent alone as a standalone episode, actually does work. So I guess that's why I liked it a lot more out of context. It was a nicely structured episode, and the story in itself worked pretty well. So, geez, okay. So, I want to talk about Dax first before I get into the controversy, because when I was watching this episode, I was thinking, God, I love the scenes with Cisco and Dax, and I love the chemistry between Dax and Cisco. And I just watched this YouTube video where this guy was trashing Dax in this episode and thought she was written horribly, and I'm like, I could not disagree with that more. Like, I feel the polar opposite. I think this is brilliant writing for Dax. And in fact, watching this episode, I realized like how much the Cisco and Dax and Jadzia Dax relationship has been developed and refined, and it works actually way better than it did in earlier seasons. And part of that was to be that Terry Farrell's acting, because I believe Deep Space Nine was the first real big role she ever had. And in a lot of interviews, she's talked about how she felt like uncomfortable and like she didn't really know what to do, but it's apparent that in later seasons she really got into that, and also the writers sort of fell into that more, and you can see the chemistry between Avery Brooks and Terry Farrell is like you can tell that they have this rapport that works, and I noted that in the season 4 episode Rejoined, which is part of my favorite part of that episode, which I think is a really underrated episode that I love, but I also think that works very strongly here. I love the scenes, I love how the interactions between Jadzia and Benjamin, like, they work so well for me, because I love when Benjamin like goes against Starfleet orders to hunt after Eddington, and Cisco's like, okay, Dax, I know what you're gonna say. You're gonna say I'm defying all orders and I'm not listening to reason. I'm letting my vendetta get the better of me. And Jadzia's like, no, I wasn't gonna say any of that. I was gonna say you remind me of Curzon. And next time I go off on some half-cocked mission, remember this. I love that. That's kind of a reference to Blood Oath, where she went off on this half-cocked mission, and Cisco was really pissed off and threatened to court-martial her or whatever, but didn't follow through with that. Um, and so she's like putting him in his place and being like, "Look, yeah, next time I do that, be more understanding." It was such great interplay, and plus I like how the punching bag scene I already talked about, like that was a great scene. And honestly, I think the Jadzia and Cisco scenes are the best thing about this episode. Honestly, I think that they were well acted. They really put the characters' motivation in perspective, and I love how Jadzia is like talking about, they're talking about the whole Javert, the Les Miserables thing, and Cisco realizes that he needs to become the villain. The way that he came to that conclusion with Jadzia, I think really worked. So I think that other particular YouTuber was more wrong than anyone has ever been wrong before. It's the exact opposite of what he said. Like, her acting was amazing. It was written very well. These were the best scenes of the episode, in my opinion. Anyway, let's get into the controversy. That's what everyone's here for. Let's talk about the controversy. Now, Cisco poisons a Maquis colony, makes it so that it is cannot sustain human life, and so the Maquis colonists have to evacuate. And he threatens to do it again unless Eddington surrenders, so he does. So I've heard several arguments, not just from one state, actually from a lot of people who state that Cisco is basically a war criminal for doing this, and that it goes completely and utterly against Starfleet principles. Some people even went as far to say that this was worse than what he did in the Pale Moonlight, which I personally think is hogwash. But leaving that aside, that is what some people think, that this is he's basically, a war criminal because... Now, the way that the episode states it, and a lot of people who think he's a war criminal kind of think that this is hogwash, as what the episode tries to tell you is kind of BS, is that what Cisco does is, because basically, Eddington poisoned the Cardassian planet first, so Cisco's just doing what Eddington did, and the way the episode states it at the end is that the human colonists and the Cardassian colonists simply just switched planets, and and so everything's all well and good because they just switched planets, so they're fine. But that's not good for a lot of people, because to be fair, I think some people bring up some good points, because they say it's a simple matter of the humans evacuate and they go to live on the Cardassian planet. But some people bring up some points. Well, what if there was a problem with, like, they're poisoning an atmosphere, making it uninhabitable for humans, and they have to evacuate, like, in a short amount of time? What if one of their ships malfunctioned? What if someone was out living in the middle of nowhere and it took forever for them to find them? What if someone was old and fell or whatever, and they got trapped behind and they died? Now, of course, the way that the episode states it, nothing like that. It's heavily implied nothing like that happened and it went smoothly, but it's always a danger, so it's a reckless thing for Cisco to simply poison an atmosphere like that. And I get that. I see that point of view. But I found a quote from Ronald D. Moore that I would like to read, which I think is very, very interesting. Now, Ronald D. Moore was a story editor, producer on Deep Space Nine at this stage. He's not credited specifically for writing this episode. It's fun. The writer who's credited for writing this episode is Peter Allen Fields, who is also credited on working on episodes like he hasn't worked on very many, but he's credited on working on episodes like The Inner Light, Duet, and in the Pale Moonlight, which I'm sorry, it makes me think this is an amazing writer. He's an awesome writer. Now, of course, not every episode he did was in that quality, because he also did this episode, which I didn't think is all that great, and he also did A Cost of Living over Next Generation, and was it Progress, which I actually hated, and Dax in season 1, which I thought was really throwaway. So he's not perfect, but he did freaking the duet circle crossover, which I think was a pretty intense episode. In the Pale in Mind, Dogs of War, the penultimate episode of DS9, which I also thought was powerful, and Half a Life over in Next Generation, which I thought was probably the best Luoxana episode. So I don't know. I just thought I'd mention that. I'd have high regards for the person who wrote this episode. But anyway, I digress. Let me say the quote from Ronald D. Moore, which I thought was really interesting. Now, we stirred it up and let people really argue about this. Sisko took an action and took a step that probably Picard wouldn't have. That's what made it an interesting episode. I could see Kirk taking this action. It seems to me like what Sisko did was basically leveling the playing field again. Eddington goes and poisons some worlds, puts some stuff in the atmosphere that makes the Cardassians have to leave. He didn't destroy the ecosystem or the biosphere because he wanted the worlds for the Maquis. Sisko just did the same thing, but did it to the Maquis, rendered some worlds uninhabitable to human life. It was a pretty drastic action, but he's out on the frontier. He has some difficult decisions to make, and it solved the problem. He pulled Eddington in off his ship, and he got results. I respected him for doing it. It was a bold decision and it worked. I think sometimes the characters have to do the right thing, even if it's difficult, and make a tough decision and not worry so much about keeping their hands clean and not be so obsessed with what the rules are sometimes. I think that Kirk was more willing to bend a rule every once in a while to serve the greater good, and I think that's what Sisko did. Now, it's interesting seeing that perspective from Ronald D. Moore, because all the detractors of this episode, and specifically of Sisko's actions in this episode, would seem to heavily disagree with that statement I just read. Particularly, I heard the argument that two wrongs don't make a right. That just because Eddington did it first does not make what Sisko did in any way, shape, or form okay. In fact, it kind of reminds me of The Expanse. Now, I'm going to give away slight spoilers for Season 5 of The Expanse, so if you haven't gotten there yet, maybe you can skip ahead a couple of minutes. But anyway, in The Expanse in Season 5, the Belter Marco Naros throws some asteroids at Earth that completely devastates it and has this, huge disaster, extinction level event. And the Earthers are like wanting to retaliate against them, so they want to blow up some Belter station strongholds. And our hero, of course, Ava Sorello, when she's arguing against it, saying they can't just kill innocent civilians. And the acting president, or Secretary General, whatever, the acting Secretary General at the time says, well, Marco Arnauers didn't care about killing civilians. And her retort is, oh, is he our role model now? Which I thought was a great line. So the point is, all that to say is I can kind of see her making the same argument against Sisko. That, oh, he poisoned some Cardassian worlds, so is Eddington our role model now? Does that make it okay to behave like him? That's the two wrongs don't make a right argument. So I can definitely see that point of view as well. So, I mean, to make it clear, I'm kind of split. Although, to be fair, I'm probably leaning more towards Ronald D. Moore's side. I think the detractors are being a bit too overzealous. I don't think Sisko's a war criminal. But I don't know if I see it exactly from Ronald D. Moore's perspective. Although I do agree with what he said of would Kirk would do this. Absolutely. And if you go back and watch some episodes of the original series, he absolutely would. He threatened, in fact, I would argue that Kirk did worse things, or at least threatened worse things. I'm thinking specifically of the episode A Taste of Armageddon, where Kirk told Scotty to destroy the entire planet of innocent civilians, children, women, farmers who had nothing to do with what the government was doing. He told Scotty to kill everyone on this planet in order to stop a war. To me, that is far worse, far worse than what Sisko does in this episode. So absolutely Kirk would have did this without a question, without blinking, without a second thought. Kirk most certainly would have done this. No question. Now, part of the argument against this is that Sisko was basically putting an entire world at risk, an entire population at risk. You know, the episode implies everything's okay, but there's a chance it couldn't have been okay. He does it just to get one man. And that's not acceptable. You can't threaten to poison the entire atmosphere of the planet. And even though the people were okay, they were displaced. You did displace a whole group of people that had to move to an unfamiliar planet and start all over again. These are colonists who spent their whole entire life, blood work. I mean, that's the whole point of the Maquis. That's why they don't want to leave these planets. They spent their entire life building something, and all of a sudden some asshole captain shoots some things just because he wants to catch some other Maquis guy, which maybe they have no affiliation with Eddington whatsoever. It has nothing to do with them. And for reasons that have nothing to do with them, they are forced to immediately evacuate over risk of dying and having to settle on this strange alien world that has like Cardassian technology. Like, so I understand that point of view. That was a fucked up thing for Sisko to do. But I don't know. I think for me, I never made a big deal out of it. I never thought that's, oh my god, I can't believe Sisko's doing this. What an asshole. And it's interesting that in the episode itself, like the officers constantly they're like, huh, what? Like when Sisko tells Worf to fire the torpedo, Worf is like, what, sir? Huh? And he's like, you heard me, Mr. Worf, fire that torpedo. And he did. It's interesting because I kept thinking that, and Kira also second guessed, I kept thinking that they were going to argue or mutiny or be like, no, this is on Starfleet, I refuse to do it, or I'm relieving you of command. But in the end, they didn't. They went along with his orders. Now, it could be that the DS9 crew are a bit more cowardly, or it could be that they trusted Sisko, that he knew what he was doing, and trusted him enough to do it. So I don't know, because I can see, even though you had these innocent civilians who may or may not have anything to do with the Maquis, but they were benefiting from the Maquis' terrorism. That would be my counter-argument to that. And so their inconvenience, and they're not dead, they survive, they're fine, they get to live in another place. So their inconvenience is caused by the terrorist actions that they were benefiting from. So that's a kind of argument to that I would see. So as you can see, I'm kind of split on this, but as I said, I think I lean towards this more of the side of the episode of what is trying to say that what Sisko did was not the worst thing ever. Should he have faced some consequences for this? I think so. I think he should have gotten a talking down to, maybe a reprimand on his record. But is he a war criminal for doing this? I think absolutely not. But, that's just my humble opinion. But it is interesting. And by the way, what he did in The Pale Moonlight is far, far, far worse. It's amazing to me anyone would even suggest that it's not as bad, that this is worse. I think that's preposterous. But, you know, that's just me. I guess the main argument they made in that case was in the Pale Moon Light, it was to save the entire Alpha Quadrant, to prevent, you know, the Federation and all the Alpha Quadrant being conquered by an oppressive, authoritarian, evil force. Whereas here, the goal was simply to capture one dude. But my counter argument to that would be what Cisco actually did to accomplish that was way worse in the Pale Moonlight than here. Because in here, as I said, basically, and this may sound callous, but basically he inconvenienced colonists who were benefiting from terrorism, if not directly involved in terrorism, inconvenienced them to move to another world. That was the end result. Now, sure, you could say, oh, he put their lives in danger, but the episode didn't specify, but I gotta believe that what Cisco did, he knew that they'd be fine. Just like what Eddington did to the Cardassians, he knew they'd be fine. He knew they'd have enough time to evacuate. He knew they'd be fine. So Cisco knew, and that's the impression I get from this episode too. So, yeah, unpopular as it may be, that is my stance on this episode. So that aspect of it actually never bothered me. I was more bothered by the fact that we didn't get that damn episode in between leading up to this. And also, not just Eddington, but also the Maquis. Because I feel like I didn't really have a handle on who the Maquis are now. Because we didn't get any episode. In fact, For the Cause, I believe, was the only Maquis episode we got in season 4. And so they didn't really explain like how the Maquis would have evolved, because they explained deeply who they were in like season 2 and season 3, but the political situation in the region completely changed when the Klingons attacked the Cardassians. And that, so the Cardassians no longer had the resources to sort of police the Maquis or care that much about the DMZ, because they were more worried about recovering from their attack against the Klingons. So, and apparently that had emboldened the Maquis to run rampant in the DMZ, but that's only implied in this episode. I think that should have been explored a fuck ton more. Again, there's that missing episode that could have explained the new dynamic of what the Maquis are trying to accomplish. And again, it's kind of implied but never explicitly stated that the Maquis kind of did get what they wanted, but they were like asking for more and being sort of more dominant and going out of bounds and beyond, and doing more sort of terrorism than simply let's get our worlds back. And they should have been more clear. There's a missing episode. I'm telling you, there's a missing episode. At least one, maybe even 2 or 3, that could have explained this a hell of a lot more. So I just feel like there's too much. I feel like I'm only getting part of the story, and I feel like I'm missing too much here. But that, again, is just my opinion. So one last thing I wanted to talk about is the holo communicators that were introduced in this episode. Which this came up as a big topic in Discovery, because Discovery is supposed to be taking place over 100 years before this, and yet this episode introduces it as if it's a new piece of technology. I'm like, ooh, look at these holo communicators. Oh, isn't there cute technology? And they use it a lot in this episode. So basically, it's instead of using a view screen, there's like a little platform with a hologram of whoever they're communicating with. And it's funny because they actually had it like behind Cisco, like behind the captain's chair in the view screen, so he basically had to turn his chair around. So I didn't really like the placement of it. Like, that didn't make sense. And I actually, to be honest, like, I think the way Discovery uses the hologram communication makes a fuck ton more sense, and it actually works better visually. But it is not, it kind of breaks canon, and a lot of people who like to bitch about how Discovery doesn't fit into Star Trek canon like to bring this up because it is an inconsistency, to be fair, because this episode makes it very clear that this is a new technology that's just being introduced. And also, it appears in one more episode, Dr. Bashir, I presume, and then after that, it's never seen or heard of again. Now, apparently, like a few writers, like Ronald D. Moore, I think specifically had to really fight for this because he thought it made a lot of sense. He thought it's, 300-400 years in the future they have all this advanced technology, yet they're talking to people on TV screens. Doesn't make any sense. And I actually agree with him. And other sci-fi like Star Wars, for example, they constantly use like the hologram communication. And it does make more sense it would be that way, and I think it is a hang-up of the original series, the whole concept of the view screen. But apparently other producers and big wigs or whatever hated the idea, and in fact I read a quote from the visual effects supervisor who thought it was dumb because they said in order for the audience to see it as 3D, they had to like rotate the camera around it in order to get the 3D feel, which I actually think that statement is dumb. I had to totally disagree with him because it was like, oh, because the audience are watching it on a 2D screen. No, that's bullshit. I disagree with it because even if the hologram is a 2D image because you're watching it on a 2D TV screen, and you get into in-universe. In-universe, it's clear that this is a 3D image, that the characters in-universe are seeing as a 3D image, and that's enough. That's all you need. That's what Star Wars does that makes it very clear. So it doesn't in other words, it doesn't have to be a 3D image for the audience as well, as long as it's a 3D image for the characters, and that's why I think that quote that the visual effects supervisor said is nonsense and quite dumb in my opinion, because he's not looking at it from an in-universe perspective, which most audience members would, because they would be wrapped up in the story of that's being told, and so they wouldn't be thinking of it in such a real life perspective. They'd be thinking of it in a more in-universe perspective, and as long as the characters in-universe are seeing a three-dimensional image, then that's all you need. Now, as far as Discovery goes, I'm not a huge fan of Discovery, and the more I think about it, the more I don't like it. But I will still defend it against people who say that it's not canon or that it breaks canon, because I actually disagree with that. Yes, there are some inconsistencies, but in my opinion, those inconsistencies are no worse than what any other Star Trek show has done. In fact, I think Voyager has the worst canon violations. But most people like to pick on the prequels like Enterprise or Discovery, but I actually think Voyager was the worst. You don't have to be a prequel in order to violate canon. But anyway, as far as this communication thing does violate canon, because this episode clearly establishes this is when it was first invented, and yet 100 years before this episode it's being commonly used. In fact, they have Pike does that stupid line in season 2 where he's like, "Oh, rip the hollow communicators out of the Enterprise. I don't like them." And that's the way they're trying. Oh, that's why it fits into canon, because they ripped the hollow. That's stupid. I hated that line. I think that was so dumb. Trying to make it work in the universe. It doesn't work in the universe. This is something I actually think you need to think outside of the universe. And outside of the universe, it's like, look, we're in the 21st century. We know that this kind of technology is actually close to being a thing now, let alone 300 years in the future. So it's ridiculous to think that this far in the future they're still talking to people on TV screens, like Ronald D. Moore said. I completely agree with him. And so I am okay with it in Discovery, because I think, and such as there's other things too that Discovery does that seems more advanced for its era, that I'm completely okay with, even if it breaks canon, because it's, you gotta just use your intellect and see that the Star Trek was created in the 60s. And some people even wanted like a prequel set in original series time to look like the 60s. And those people absolutely got their head in the clouds. They're completely clueless, in my opinion. There's no way you can make a modern show that looks like it belongs in the 60s, especially the Star Trek show. I mean, if you do like a comedy show or a retro show that's meant to look like it's in the 60s, it's something different. But you do a modern day drama that's supposed to be taken seriously, like, it has to look, especially if it's set in the future. You can't have it look like it's set in the past, unless, of course, that's its shtick. But that's not the shtick for Star Trek, and it wouldn't work. It's so that's I just think that's preposterous. So bottom line is, yes, it does break canon, but I don't care. I'm okay with it. And in fact, I'm that way for most of the sort of technology complaints. As far as Discovery goes, but story complaints I care about more. But that's me. That's just my. Some people have a hang up on technology, or for me, it's like, no, that makes sense, and I agree with Ronald D. Moore. In fact, they should have done this hologram thing going forward. Although I will say, as I said, the aesthetics of it in this episode weren't working. It didn't make sense to me how Sisko had to turn his chair around to talk to people. And plus, how come everyone he was talking to was standing up, yet he was sitting in his chair? Anyway, my rating for the uniform out of 10, I'm going to give this a 7, very good, which again is a lot higher than when I gave my season rewatch. I had to look it up. I think I gave it like a 3 or 4, maybe a 5. I think it was a 5, actually, but I'm going higher. I'm going 7 because, again, the Dax and Sisko scenes were great. It was great acting, great character interaction, great chemistry. I think that really drove the episode. I think the episode is well structured, too, from start to finish, about how obsessed Sisko is and how Eddington keeps getting the better until Sisko has to stoop down to his level in order to defeat him. I like that. I think that really worked. But as I said, like, there's too much missing in context. This episode is kind of out of nowhere. It is not well earned. So that definitely keeps it from getting anything higher than a 7. But yeah, my opinion on this episode at least is 1 up. So anyway, that is it for my review of For the Uniform. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out my other Star Trek videos, which I have many of, and many more to come, and as well as doing reviews on other shows like The Expanse, Breaking Bad, The Outer Limits, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.